This incredible concept car was the inspiration for an entire generation of General Motors cars. What was its killer feature? Find out on One of a Kind now. Just like people, cars have ancestors. If you follow a car's lineage, you can trace the history of a feature or a design choice. You can find influence between different car manufacturers, between Europe and America. Sometimes you find a common ancestor, a car that shares its DNA with a generation of cars to follow. This is the story of a model car that narrowly missed being lost to history. This is the story of the 1955 Chevy Biscayne. Harley Earl, the first vice president of design for General Motors, pioneered the concept of building cars to display design ideas. His first attempt to place General Motors at the vanguard of design was the Buick Y-Job, introduced in 1939.
In the earliest days, automobile design was dictated by the mechanical engineers, so there was more form and function than there was design. General Motors had spotted Harley Earl out in California, and he was doing cars for movie stars and dignitaries out there. They were quite simply amazing. They were the first totally designed cars by an automobile stylist. General Motors liked what he was doing so well that they commissioned him to come in and do the 27 LaSalle. It was such a success that General Motors then hired Harley Earl to come and start the first dedicated automotive design studio, which was called Art and Color. From that point on, it was all about the design of the car. It was all about the look and feel. It was all about the forward vision of design of the automobile.
The Y-Job was only the first of many concept cars to roll off GM design blueprints. Dream cars became an annual tradition, especially after the war when style became preeminent.
Once it was realized that the success of the first concept vehicle to gauge the reaction of the public to upcoming designs, General Motors went all out and started the Motorama. And the Motorama would feature a special car, concept vehicle, or dream car from each division.
At first, these concept cars were stored for posterity. But as the country endured a recession, GM decided it could no longer afford to store its legacies and sent them to the junkyard to be scrapped. That's where this owner found his dream car, cut up into pieces in the corner of a junkyard.
The story was that in 1957 there was a severe recession, and the bean counters, as they very often do, kind of took over the reins at General Motors, and they started economizing. And they said, what do we got all these show cars in storage? They're costing us money. And there was 4 cars that they wanted off the books before the end of the year. So they called one of the guys that was on his Christmas vacation, and it was required at General Motors that somebody from General Motors witness the cutting and the crushing of the cars. And so he took this car, he took it there to the junkyard 2 days before Christmas Eve. And he saw him cut it up, and he said, I know you guys are gonna crush the rest of the pieces. I'm getting out of here. My wife wants me home for Christmas. He left, and they immediately hit all the pieces.
After rescuing the Biscayne from its near-death experience, its new owner rebuilt it and discovered that he didn't have just any concept car. He had the forerunner of several of GM's most classic cars.
You know, there's several cars that have the DNA of this particular car. If you check out the hubcaps, they're really almost exactly the hubcaps that were used on the 1957 Chevrolet. If you check out the fender line right at the front, you'll find out that it's almost exactly the fender line that was used on the 1963-64 Riviera. If you go to the back of the car, you'll see that the back of the car is just almost dead on the 1960 Corvair. The windshield, where it wraps up into the roof, is exactly the windshield that was used on the 1959 General Motors full-size cars across the board. The scoops on the side, flipped over 180 degrees, were what was superimposed on the 1956 Corvette, which was really a modification of the 1955, 54, and 53 Corvette. You can see that this DNA that was in this car spread out to all sorts of other General Motors cars from the top to the bottom. And that's what it was supposed to do. I mean, that was one of the ideas of the whole idea of design cues, was these little ideas, see how the public reacts to it, and then take and use that for future designs.
The design of this Biscayne inspired a generation of GM products. But its most important innovation was under the hood. What automotive era did this Biscayne kick off? Find out right after this. This 1955 Chevy Biscayne was rescued from a junkyard and restored to its former glory. Its design cues helped inspire a generation of GM products, from the Corvair and Chevette to the Riviera. But one of its most lasting innovations was under the hood.
This particular car does have one design part that's not typical of Motorama cars. Most Motorama cars didn't have any engineering feats in them, but this one is the showcase for the introduction of the 1955 Chevrolet V8. Up till this time, up till 1955, Chevrolet only had a straight six.
To make sure the engine stood out, the Chevrolet engineering team walked away from some of its long-held traditions.
When you look at this engine, you'll see that it's all painted silver and it's chromed and it's absolutely beautiful. And the reason for that is that this was the showcase for that engine.
As the restoration began, the new owner found a talented fiberglass artist to help him rebuild the Biscayne's body.
The color was still on the car. You could still see the green. The chrome was there, and amazingly, it wasn't badly pitted, and it had been outside. It was literally outside for 50-some years. There was no chassis and no interior. And I just brought back the pieces. I had them laying in a corner, and one day a guy named John Busey came along, who was a fabricator of fiberglass displays and a kind of an Italian artist. And I told him what the pieces were. He said, well, I can put that together. So he took the pieces and he glued them all together and it looked like a body that was lifted off a chassis.
Later, the new owner would find a chassis builder who was able to reconstruct the Biscayne's chassis from a photograph from GM's archives. When they were finished, they had a fully restored representation of one of the most significant cars of the Motorama era.
In my mind's eye, the Motorama cars, of all the cars that are produced as show cars, dream cars, concept cars, the Motorama cars are probably the most significant.
Since its restoration, this Chevy Biscayne has made its way around the country, reintroduced to a new generation of car enthusiasts.
We show it at some of the bigger car shows. It's been in a lot of magazines. It's got a lot of notoriety. And it's a very, very important piece. All your General Motors Motorama cars are extremely important.
There were distinctive designs that totally said General Motors. General Motors was probably the only automobile manufacturer at the time to have these forward-looking, very designed automobiles.
Sometimes you can try and kill something, but it just doesn't work. I mean, GM actually went ahead and they scrapped cars like this, and yet the design cues lived on. And that's really interesting. That's how important these design cues really were, that they could scrap the car, and all of a sudden, parts of the car would start appearing on other future GM cars.
This 1955 Chevrolet Biscayne was the ancestor of several design cues from some of GM's most iconic cars. What is its place in automotive history? We'll find out right after this. Rescued from a junkyard, this 1955 Chevy Biscayne was brought back from near death as one of the all-time classic GM concept cars. The new owner sees this Biscayne as far more than just another car.
I believe that all artifacts of history are not only important for the way they look, but they're also important for what they reflect on what was going on at that period of time. This reflects on the idea that if you got it, flaunt it because of World War II. So it helps you study history, not only of the cars, but history of what was going on during that time period.
This 1955 Chevy Biscayne kicked off a new era of engineering and design at General Motors. Although GM tried to have it crushed, its design ideas inspired cars for another 10 years. This Biscayne is the granddaddy of the classic Corvette, Corvair, and Riviera, making it absolutely one of a kind.